For 65 years, I have woken beside the same man. The same rise and fall of his chest. The same morning cough that rattles from somewhere deep inside. Sometimes in those quiet dawn hours, I wonder if he remembers the man he once was. The man who could ride me all night long with something wicked curled between his teeth, laughing like he had the strength of 40 men. Back then, his hands never tired, and neither did his hunger. Our nights belonged to us, stolen and spent in a frenzy of tangled sheets and whispered promises neither of us believed but clung to just the same. Now his sleep is heavy and dreamless. Nights pass in silence except for the hum of the bedside lamp and the creak of the old house settling. He rests and I watch him, this man who was once my storm, reduced to still water. I love him. I always have. But I can't remember the last time he looked at me like I was something worth ruining himself over. It's the small deaths that hurt the most, I think. The ways we disappear in plain sight. One forgotten touch at a time. He used to press me against the kitchen counter just because the sun hit my shoulders a certain way. Now he asks if I've seen his reading glasses and mutters over the crossword. 65 years, and sometimes I wonder if I am already a ghost, haunting the home we built. It's during these thoughts, these quiet funerals I hold for the girl I used to be, that I notice him. The neighbor boy, not quite a boy anymore really. 30 perhaps, or close enough to make the difference feel obscene. I see him most afternoons tending to his mother's garden, sleeves rolled to his elbows, dirt caked beneath his nails. There is something unapologetic about the way he moves, like he's still unburdened by the weight of time. And sometimes, only sometimes he looks up and catches me watching. He never waves, never calls out. Just holds my gaze like he knows exactly who I used to be. Should mean nothing. I tell myself this each time I linger at the window longer than necessary. He's only being polite. Curious maybe. But it plants a seed all the same. I start finding excuses to step outside. To check the mailbox twice a day when no letters ever come. To water plants that don't need saving. Sometimes we exchange hellos. Once he asked if I needed help carrying groceries. His fingers brushed mine as he took the bag from me, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I might come undone right there on the front steps. When I was younger, I used to laugh at women who talked like this. Restless wives searching for meaning in the glance of a stranger. Seemed so dramatic, so pitiful. Yet here I am, standing in the same worn slippers I've had for 20 years, wondering what it would feel like if someone touched me like they wanted to burn. At night, while my husband sleeps, I remember things I shouldn't. The weight of desire. The reckless pulse of skin against skin. I remember the version of myself who used to ache for no reason at all. And I wonder, has she left me completely, or is she still buried inside, waiting to be found? The neighbor boy man was outside again today. Fixing a loose gate this time. He caught my eye through the window and nodded. Not much, just enough to make it feel deliberate. The smallest of acknowledgments, but it left me unsettled for the rest of the afternoon. I baked bread I didn't need and cleaned the same countertop 3 times over. When my husband asked if something was wrong, I smiled and said no. Course not. What could possibly be wrong after all this time? Still, as the evening settled and the house grew dark around us, I found myself standing at the window again, watching shadows move beyond the fence line, wondering if the version of myself who used to dance barefoot in the kitchen might still remember the steps. It's foolish, all of it. I know this. I'm 73 years old. My skin doesn't glow the way it used to, and my body is softer in places that used to be sharp. But desire is a cruel thing. It doesn't care how many years you've worn someone's ring. It doesn't care that your love has become a quiet, steady thing like rain on the roof. Sometimes it still wakes you up in the middle of the night, whispering, "What if?" Tonight, as I lay beside my husband and listened to the familiar rhythm of his breathing, I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone looked at me like I was still alive. And worse, I wasn't sure if I'd stopped looking for it. Outside the window, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of fresh earth and distant rain. I imagined footsteps on the path. A knock at the door that wouldn't come. The heat of someone standing too close. The temptation of being noticed, truly noticed, for the first time in years. And as I drifted off to sleep, I asked myself the question that had begun to bloom inside me like a bruise. Does desire still belong to me? Or have I given it all away? The answer didn't come. But the ache of the question was enough to keep me awake. It started with the smallest of chances. A power outage on a damp, forgettable evening. One moment the lights were humming, the next, the house was swallowed in shadow. My husband, already long asleep in his chair, stirred only enough to mumble about the fuse box before drifting back into a snore. I left him there, tucked beneath his knitted blanket, and lit a candle. When I opened the door to check if the whole street had gone dark, he was there, the neighbor, lantern in hand, the soft glow catching on the curve of his jaw, the damp of his collar. He looked at me like I'd been expected. "Power's out on my side too," he said, voice low and easy. "Thought I'd see if you needed anything." I almost told him no. I almost shut the door and returned to my ordinary night, the same as any other. But the words stuck in my throat. And instead I stepped aside. "Come in just for a bit," I heard myself say. "If you'd like." The air inside felt different with him standing there. Charged, as though the house itself remembered the woman I'd been before the years softened me. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Between us, the candle flickered, casting our shadows along the walls. We spoke quietly. At first about nothing. How often the power went out, the coming forecast, the stubborn gate he'd been fixing. But conversation has a way of finding the cracks in people, and soon we were talking about lonelier things. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "This waiting, taking care of everything, being here. It must feel endless some days." I smiled the way people do when they're trying to hide the truth. "It's not so bad," I lied. 65 years goes faster than you think." He watched me then. Really watched me. Like my words were something fragile that might splinter if held too tightly. His gaze wasn't cruel or careless. It was worse. It was understanding. Somewhere in the pause between what was appropriate and what was necessary. His hand found mine across the table. I should have pulled away. Instead, my fingers curled around his like they belonged there. Warm, strong, certain. "It's nice to be noticed," I whispered before I could stop myself. And there it was. The first betrayal. Not the touch. Not the glance. But the confession that I wanted more. That I missed being seen. The rain began softly against the windows. In another life, it might have been romantic. In this one, it simply covered the sound of our breathing. He didn't ask permission. He didn't have to. When he rose from his chair and rounded the table, I tilted my face toward him like a woman starved. He paused only a moment, his thumb brushing the corner of my mouth, before his lips met mine. It was not a kiss of youth or of recklessness. It was something far more dangerous. Tender. Careful. Like he was rediscovering something that had been left abandoned too long. And I let him. 'Cause I wanted to remember. I wanted to remember how it felt to be kissed not out of habit but out of want. We didn't rush. There was no urgency in the way he cupped my face. No wild tearing at clothes or fevered breath. Just the steady, aching pull of two people who understood that time had already stolen too much from them. When we parted, the space between us felt heavier than before. He didn't step away, and I didn't move to make him. "My husband," I whispered, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. "Asleep," he replied softly. And somehow that made it worse. Because it wasn't the secrecy that shamed me. It was the ease of it all. How natural it felt to stand there, bathed in candlelight, with his hand at the small of my back and his lips ghosting the curve of my throat. There was a sound from the other room. Just the shifting of the recliner. But it was enough to pull us both back. We should. I started. Yeah, he agreed. And yet neither of us moved. The storm outside deepened, and the house felt impossibly small. He brushed his knuckles along my arm as if memorizing the shape of me. A silent promise in the gesture. This wasn't the end. When he finally left, I lingered in the doorway, watching the swing of the lantern disappear into the dark. I pressed my fingertips to my lips, half expecting the kiss to have left something behind. Mark. Sign. Anything to make sense of what had just happened. But there was nothing. Only me. Still standing. Still waiting. Still wondering how far I might let this go. Behind me, my husband shifted again, mumbling in his sleep. I glanced toward him. The man who had once been my everything. Who still was, in every way except the ones that seemed to matter most lately. And as I blew out the candle and climbed back into bed beside him, the answer came quietly, like the hush of rain on the roof. This was only the beginning. It happened on a night so ordinary it felt almost cruel. The television murmured low in the living room. My husband had fallen asleep in his chair again. His glasses slipping down his nose, a crossword unfinished on his lap. I kissed his forehead the way I always did, the way habit demands, and whispered I was going to bed. He barely stirred. But I didn't go upstairs. I didn't even turn out the lights. Instead, I stood by the window watching the dark, waiting. And as if summoned by thought alone, there he was, the neighbor. His silhouette paused by the gate, hands in his pockets, as if deciding whether the night belonged to him or if he should leave it untouched. I opened the door before he could knock. Neither of us spoke. Words had become irrelevant, flimsy things. There was only the weight of what we'd both come to claim. Inside, the house felt different with him there after midnight. The air heavier, thick with unspoken things. The clock on the wall marked each second like a warning. We passed through the kitchen and into the den, where the fire had gone out hours earlier but the scent of ash still lingered. I turned to face him and he stepped closer, slow, deliberate. Like I was something worth approaching carefully. And when his lips found mine again, there was no hesitation. No stolen glances toward the hallway. No listening for the sound of shifting blankets or creaking floors. The decision had already been made. His hands explored what time had tried to erase. Every curve softened by age, every line etched by the years. But he didn't shrink from them. He mapped me like I was territory to be rediscovered, and in that I felt something close to resurrection. We didn't rush. There was reverence in the way he peeled back the years with his fingertips, like he understood the weight I carried just to stand there in front of him, exposed and vulnerable. His mouth traced the places I'd forgotten could still respond. Along the collarbone, the hollow of my throat, the tender skin behind my knee. Places my husband hadn't thought to linger in decades. I let him lay me down on the couch, where the fabric was rough beneath my back, and the old blanket slid to the floor. I watched the muscles in his arms flex as he moved over me. His face hidden in the dark, and for a moment, it felt as if I'd stepped outside of my own skin. Like I was watching some other woman, a braver woman, a younger woman, living a life I thought had passed me by. The rhythm of us was patient, intimate, less about urgency than about proving it wasn't too late to want, to be wanted. He filled the silence with sighs and whispered affirmations, things I'd stopped believing about myself years ago. And I let go. Of the years, the guilt, the versions of myself I'd buried under routine and duty. For a time, I let myself be a woman again. Not just a wife or a shadow moving through the edges of her own life, but someone desired, someone alive. Afterward, he stayed beside me, his fingers trailing idle patterns along my hip. Neither of us spoke. There was no need to give it names or shape it into something larger than it was. We both knew it existed in a fragile space, a secret suspended between the dark and dawn. But dawn comes all the same. When the first hint of light pressed against the edges of the curtains, he rose, dressed quietly, touched my cheek as if to memorize the moment, and then he left without asking for anything more. I pulled the blanket back over myself and lay there, staring at the ceiling as the house around me began to stir. Pipes groaned, floorboards creaked. The familiar rituals of morning returned as if nothing had shifted. Except everything had. By the time my husband shuffled in, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, asking if we still had coffee, I was back in the kitchen, the same woman I'd always been. I kissed his cheek. I poured his cup. I asked if he slept well. And he smiled, the same sleepy, grateful smile I'd seen every morning for half a century. Looking at him, I expected to feel something sharp. Guilt like a stone in the throat. Regret heavy as wet wool. But what I felt instead was stillness. Not relief. Not remorse. Just the quiet understanding that I had done something irreversible, and yet somehow I was still standing. That afternoon, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Paused longer than usual. Studied the woman looking back at me. There were the lines of age, yes. The silver at the temples. The softness at the waist. But there was something else too. Something newly awake behind the eyes. It wasn't love I had found in the arms of another man. Not even happiness exactly. It was permission. Permission to remember I was still here. Still capable of wanting. Still deserving of being wanted in return. And whether I crossed that line again or let it end in the quiet safety of memory, I knew one thing for certain. Desire had never left me. I had simply stopped believing I deserved to feel it. And now I wasn't so sure I could go back to pretending otherwise.